Hello, welcome to interview questions. In fact, this is going to be more focused on what are the questions can be asked on SCCM. So it can be an interviewer or who are attending the interview. So both the ways it would be useful this session or this lecture. So this is going to be more about interview point of view, extract the knowledge and experience from other end. So I'm gonna define a few of these sections. Mostly the questions would come up from, I would put it in this way. The first one would be I can say that designing side. You may have the fundamental side, you may have the sizing and scaling, and also you may have and the planning side. So these are the 4 pages you would be getting most of the interview questions. So we can't say which question is coming up, but I'm gonna ask you and give the best examples, best answers, or best references where you can go ahead and check them. That's what it's going to be this entire video. And also definitely I'm gonna add some of the quizzes so that you would know how to answer those questions. Definitely. And if you're not able to get the answers out of this 4, definitely you should go to Microsoft site, which is nothing but doc.microsoft.com/SCCM. So in this the answers will be there, but it's difficult to get that exact answer, right? So if you know and if you know how to configure, if you have worked on that SCCM feature, especially on the operation side or designing side or planning side, or if you know the fundamental of that specific feature, you can answer that questions definitely without any doubt. So let's jump into the a few of the questions. Hello, welcome to interview questions. In fact, this is going to be more focused on what are the questions can be asked on SCCM. So it can be an interviewer or who are attending the interview. So both the ways it would be useful this session or this lecture. So this is going to be more about interview point of view, to extract the knowledge and experience from other end. So I'm gonna define a few of these sections. Mostly the questions would come up from, I would put it in this way. The first one would be I can say that designing side. You may have the fundamental side, you may have the sizing and scaling, and also you may have and the planning side. So these are the 4 pages you would be getting most of the interview questions. So we can't say which question is coming up, but I'm gonna ask you and give the best examples, best answers, or best references where you can go ahead and check them. That's what it's going to be this entire video. And also definitely I'm gonna add some of the quizzes so that you would know how to answer those questions. Definitely. And if you're not able to get the answers out of this 4, definitely you should go to Microsoft site, which is nothing but doc.microsoft.com/SCCM. So in this the answers will be there, but it's difficult to get that exact answer, right? So if you know and if you know how to configure, if you have worked on that SCCM feature, especially on the operation side or designing side or planning side, or if you know the fundamental of that specific feature, you can answer that questions definitely without any doubt. So let's jump into the a few of the questions. Welcome to interview questions. In fact, this is going to be more focused on what are the questions can be asked on SCCM. So it can be an interviewer or who are attending the interview. So both the ways it would be useful this session or this lecture. So this is going to be more about interview point of view, to extract the knowledge and experience from other end. So I'm gonna define a few of these sections. Mostly the questions would come up from, I would put it in this way. The first one would be I can say that designing side. You may have the fundamental side, you may have the sizing and scaling, and also you may have and the planning side. So these are the 4 pages you would be getting most of the interview questions. So we can't say which question is coming up, but I'm gonna ask you and give the best examples, best answers, or best references where you can go ahead and check them. That's what it's going to be this entire video. And also definitely I'm gonna add some of the quizzes so that you would know how to answer those questions. Definitely. And if you're not able to get the answers out of this four, definitely you should go to Microsoft site, which is nothing but doc.microsoft.com/SCCM. So in this, the answers will be there, but it's difficult to get that exact answer, right? So if you know and if you know how to configure, if you have worked on that SCCM feature, especially on the operation side or designing side or planning side, or if you know the fundamental of that specific feature, you can answer that questions definitely without any doubt. So let's jump into the a few of the questions. Hello, welcome to interview questions. In fact, this is going to be more focused on what are the questions can be asked on SCCM. So it can be an interviewer or who are attending the interview. So both the ways it would be useful this session or this lecture. So this is going to be more about interview point of view, to extract the knowledge and experience from other end. So I'm gonna define a few of the sections. Mostly the questions would come up from, I would put it in this way. The first one would be I can say that designing side. You may have the fundamental side, you may have the sizing and scaling, and also you may have on the planning side. So these are the 4 pages you would be getting most of the interview questions. So we can't say which question is coming up, but I'm gonna ask you and give the best examples, best answers, or best references where you can go ahead and check them. That's what it's going to be this entire video. And also definitely I'm gonna add some of the quizzes so that you would know how to answer those questions. Definitely. And if you're not able to get the answers out of this 4, definitely you should go to Microsoft site, which is nothing but doc.microsoft.com/SCCM. So in this, the answers will be there, but it's difficult to get that exact answer, right? So if you know and if you know how to configure, if you have worked on that SCCM feature, especially on the operation side or designing side or planning side, or if you know the fundamental of that specific feature, you can answer that questions definitely without any doubt. So let's jump into the a few of the questions. The first question, maybe you may get it like, tell me about yourself and your experience, background on, especially on SCCM. I'm really not going to explain that. But I'm going to more focus on acting the exact content that we should expect from other end, vice versa. In fact, if you are the interviewer and if you're taking the interview, we need to validate the technical aspects. So that's where the more key focus. So the first question would be, what exactly the SCCM? So people may start from SMS, and they also can talk about the products of the family of SCCM. In fact, we did talk about the introduction of this section. If you can see here on the section, this is the introduction section of our course, and you can also start talking about the features and each feature, how best you can actually utilize this with these features. For example, you can talk about the patch management, software distribution, or the application deployment, operating system deployment, different inventory mechanisms, or whatever the features we are listed here, that all we can talk about it. And also you can simply add a little bit that how your company is getting benefited out of the SCCM, or maybe the other companies are getting benefited. Like take some kind of case studies and explain them so that they get a good feel that you are really working on a SCCM and you know how to use that specific product. That's the intention of the question. The next question, from my point of view, what exactly the SMS provider? In fact, we exactly discussed about the SMS provider and the WMI related in detail in our course. especially under vocabulary section. If you can go back to the vocabulary section, so you can take those definitions and explain them. But in a short and sweet, I can say that SMS provider is your WMI provider, right? It's nothing but it's purely built on WMI, right? And you can talk about the use cases of the WMI provider, because to connect from your whatever your actions you're performing on your SCCM console, in the background it is actually running on SMS provider, and that would actually communicate with your SQL database, right? And that's where the you can find out more information. In fact, if you open smsproof.log file, let me show you that in my SCCM console. In fact, I'm not using the my on-premises SCCM. As I said, you can use any of the lab here, which is a freely available lab. So I can show you that some of the actions. You can check out this free lab where if you have the internet, you can access this lab, which is connected over the internet under section 5. I did mention very clearly how to use this entire lab for free, in fact, right? Let's also focus now the question. The question would be if you can go back to smsproof.log file. This tells more detail about how SMS provider is working. If you can read at least few of the lines, in fact I recommend to read at least 10-15 lines here and there on each page, and that makes you more comfort on SMS provider. Because if you see here what exactly it is doing, I'm just connected with the SCCM console, so it is just saying that hey, you have connected with the console-administrator, and it does that information. And then also it is actually querying to the WQL or to WMI and gets that exact information. For example, if you can see here, it's actually pulling up from the start select star from SMS identification. So that's a class. That's where it's pulling up all those information, whether does this user have the permission or not. And similarly, it's going to execute all the activities which you are actually performing. For example, if I do a refresh of the collections, let me go back and see.
Hello and welcome back.
If I do the refresh of any of the collections here, it's going to actually perform in the background. Of course, you can find out this anyway in the admin.ui.log file related to the administration of this console. But if you go back in the in this, see, this is where it is actually requesting to the changes. That means whatever the activities you are performing on your SCCM console, in the background it is connected and it is working with the help of SMS provider. So that means in other way it actually connects to your SQL database, which is nothing but your SCCM database in this case, and it gets that information for you. So you can tell in that way about the SMS provider. Few of the questions can be asked related to the client assignment. Especially you might get an error. For example, the client is not able to communicate with the SCCM server. So this is the common scenario. You might get it at least once or twice in your SCCM career. If you are the SCCM admin, you might be already getting this kind of issues in your operations work, at least in a year once at least. So let's talk about the client assignment. So the question can be asked in other way: hey, can I assign my SCCM clients to my secondary site? Definitely no, because the clients always assigned to a primary site. It can fall back for a content to the secondary site if it has a distribution point, but normally the clients will assign to the primary site. So let's talk about the client assignment, how the client is getting actually the site code information. So if somebody is asking about more about the client is not able to get the site code, that means the first point would be you need to find out what is that computer is connected over the if it's a computer domain joint. Definitely people might go with a boundaries to configure with Active Directory sites or the IP address range or the subnets. The recommended way would be, first one would be the AD site names. So you need to find out by opening up your command prompt on the problem machine and simply type setl. That gives the domain control name, and you can check that whether it is actually logging into the any of the domain controller. And then you can find out by opening the, let's open the SCCM client machine in this case, and test more on that point of view, I just log into one of the test machine, which is nothing but my SCCM client machine. I can simply type settle to know that, hey, whether this is actually logged into the domain or not. And then I'm gonna type definitely ipconfig to find out more about the IP configuration. And you can find out the IP address information by doing by having all this information. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna actually test in a reverse way. So how the client, first of all, how the client will get the site code information, that if you know it, then it makes more easy for you. So the first point would be here, just open up the SCCM logs with the help of your trace toolkit and go back to the client locations. So just open the client location.log file, and this log, trust me, it gives the more information about how this machine is connected. For example, if you just go up, it says that, hey, I'm connected to this domain, which is called contest.com, and the machine is joined. Client is an intranet, that means in the local network, because we also talked about the intranet and internet based topics, especially in the cloud management gateway and other things. You can check out here, the SCCM client site code was currently assigned to PO1. So that means that's very interesting that, how this PO1 is came. If you can go back to another log file called location services. Earlier one is the client locations, if you can see. Now I'm gonna just reverse back that, the name almost, location services. So in this case, it tells more than what exactly found this. So this is the last step where you have the client locations, but as a first step, you should be checking location services.log file. In fact, this gives more than what you can expect. In fact, if you can see here, it also mentions the information as the machine is part of which AD site, which is called a Conteso machine. It falls under Conteso AD. Site name, if you can see here somewhere, it is saying that, hey, AD site name is Conteso. How the site is came up. So if you can go back to Active Directory by connecting to one of your domain controller. In fact, I'm just going, all this lab is free for you. In fact, if you just go with my course, where to access this lab. This kind of more of the information I have already hard coded for you. Now let's go back to the Active Directory sites and services. In this case, just opening the sites and services, which is nothing but Active Directory sites and services from the administrative tools. You have here all the site names. So this is where what happened is your Active Directory team guys, they coordinated with the networking team by finding this is a site is nothing, it represents basically a physical location. Say let's take as a location name called maybe Redmond. In fact, we all discussed all these topics we talked about in detail in the section 6, and for the first time configuration. The same thing have been repeated twice to understand better way. So if you have, or if you can go through with this, you could have easily answered this question. In fact, so let's jump into the actual question. Since this is represents the physical side, so the Active Directory team will go and communicate with networking team that, hey, what are the IP ranges, what are the subnets you are actually creating in this network. So they would create some kind of subnet. So in this case, they created this as one of the subnets. So what we have done is, once they provided that subnet information, we simply add here as a subnet. For example, we simply add here a different subnet. In this case, for example, if network team is provided by 10.10.0 slash maybe idle, something like that, and we select as a console and simply click on OK. So this subnet, once they provided, in fact, that would be added to the console, right, while creating. So in the similar way, whatever the physical office location you have, you may end up with one subnet at least to the each site, which is a physical site, or maybe sometimes more than one site. For example, if you have in one location, which is a big location, for example California, you may have more than 3 to 4 different offices in the different regions altogether. Then I'm sorry, not different regions, different locations altogether within the California, then you might end up with a different networking subnet. So in that case, all of them to be added. So now what happened is here, the SCCM client, actually, let's go back to the SCCM client and find out what happened is this was found that IP address information, whatever the IP address we just gathered, this IP address is falling. If you can go back and check it, 2.series is falling under Conteso site. That's why it's getting the site code. But now in a milliseconds of the time, what would happen is, in the background, where did we configure in fact this? So we did configure under configuration manager. Under this boundaries, we did configure. So this boundaries actually have that contour. But if I just go back to these boundaries must be assigned to one of the boundary groups. So in this case, if you can check it, the boundary groups, for example, for the distribution point, for the headquarters is completely different, and for this is a different. So now the boundaries will be a part of your boundary groups for the content location as well as this for the site code. If you enable this checkbox, that means the site code will be pulled by the SCCM clients. Then it also verifies where should I go for the content in this case. So let's check it. In this case, actually, if you can check, if you can look at the contours or headquarters properties of the boundary group, you do selected this one. So that's where the site code is coming. Now, if you look at from where actually the content coming. So content was coming up from here, which is a different altogether. Again, one more boundary. For these two of the subnets, you are getting content from this side, and that's where the content is coming up. And also, if you can see here with the 1902 onwards, you also have an option called peer to be downloaded. I really forgot the exact version. I'm sorry for that, but you do have this option to download within that boundary group. So it doesn't mean that you no need to go for the branch cache mechanism to depend on peer cache. Instead, you can configure this mechanism so only the SCCM relevant content can be peer cached as soon as the packages are downloaded. So if you want to answer this question, client assignment, you should be starting from the network location of that machine and the boundaries and the boundary groups, and whether this client assignment was configured as a site code, and then from where the content is coming up, and what is the management point it is configured. If you can answer all these, if you can explain this, the client can get that site code as well as it can get the content from the configured distribution points as well as the management points, that policies information. From my end, the next questions would be, what is exactly the SCCM hierarchy and what are the SCCM types? So in this case, you should be actually explaining about the primary side, central administration side, secondary sides, and you should be the main idea for the asking for this question would be to get or to extract from the other person what kind of hierarchy they have, how many sites he is managing, so that the interview taker can expect that, oh, he can manage my SCCM hierarchy. That's the goal maybe for him, but you should be able to answer how many primary sites you have, what is your SCCM client count, and what are the features you enabled, and the reason behind for configuring those primaries and secondaries and the central administration side. If at all you're not using CAS site, why you're not using, and all that may come up in the next conversations when when somebody asks this question, in fact. So you should be fairly able to tell about this SCCM hierarchy, as we discussed in our course, why we have to configure primaries and the secondaries, and the and also the reporting structure. For example, the top level is the CAS side, definitely followed by the primaries at the second layer, and the down would be the secondary side. So as I said, most of the questions answered by these 5 different pages, right? The first one would be the hierarchy related the question, right? So when you talk about this hierarchy, you should be able to talk what is in this actually web page. For example, the site's information, the design, why you configured the secondary sites, and the content management options which are available. In fact, we did deeply discuss all these content related options in our video. Then they may also ask you for the SMS provider and database related scaling. And I feel sometimes from this is where you can extract the knowledge, or you can extract the what kind of knowledge the other in person have. So this is where you need to be more strong and more questions can be expected. So if you can go through these pages, it really helps you a lot, in fact. And you can also talk your infrastructure, or maybe the client, one of the client supported infrastructure, by taking this one of the example. Say example, if you are just working on a standalone, this would be the case, in fact. But if you are working on maybe on the second layer, which is nothing but your secondary sites and the primary, and this would be the design, and this would be the very bigger, larger enterprises where they can configure this kind of hierarchy. In fact, if you can look at here, Canada, Toronto has the CAS, and from there it is actually configured one of the primary in the Houston, London, Shanghai. So these three blue boxes at the second layer has the primary sites, and from there the local locations, maybe Houston to Seattle and Boston, you can configure the secondary sites so that you can control the more traffic, in fact, or more content management can be done in terms of by configuring the secondary site. So you need to tell those reasons, and you need to tell why did you went, or why didn't you choose in those scenarios, in fact. So that's where the question to answer can be fulfilled. Sometimes the people also gives you the more questions related to how do you design your hierarchy. So that's the architect level of question, or maybe people sometimes they just ask you this kind of questions also. So you should be able to tell that you need to understand their topology by shooting few other questions to the other person, like topology information you need to gather, the sites and their relationships with each other, and the scope of that management, because most of the time the scope of the management comes into the political management, right? For some regions they don't want to put that content to be go out of their region. In that situation, it's going to be a political decision. So in that situation, what kind of role-based access management to be implemented, or do we plan for a new site? All that comes under a questionnaire case, and you should be able to understand very well, and then you can go for a simple or a complex one of the hierarchy you can choose. You can also check out this questionnaires, self questionnaires, which are coming out of the beyond hierarchy topology questions, whether you want to use the PKI or IBCM or CMG, or you want to go for the co-management to be enabled, or planning for your site database, and the security and the rules, features that to be enabled. All that should be talked for this question. People may also ask related to the hierarchy side, can we have more than one management point? So you can talk about, yes, definitely you can have more than one management point, starting from the latest versions of the configuration manager, current branch. So you can enable. Earlier we used to depend on the NLB, but now you can go for completely side by side kind of additional management points also can be enabled. People may ask for different log files at the client side, like for the inventory management, and how, for example, for the hardware inventory management. Either if you are trying to pull for the hardware inventory or software inventory, it's going to be inventory agent.log file, which will be available on the client side. And also people may ask you for the how best you can extend your hardware inventory. So we did talked about that by enabling or by using one of our tool, MorphComp extractor tool. With that tool we extended our hardware inventory classes, and that can be talked for you. If you can remember, from the client agents properties, you have the hardware inventory classes. This is where you can set a different hardware inventory can be extended. So you need to import those MOV files, and then that automatically compiles. So they might be looking for the logs also. Let's say example, you can open the .ldr log file, for example. So this is where actually this log is key, in fact, right? We talked about the hardware inventory deep dive about this log file, as well as the hardware extension. If you do any kind of extra hardware inventory, if you're trying to collect, this is the log file which will be key for you to get that information. So to begin with, to answer this question, one example, let's minimize this. If I go back to this classes, for example, if I want to collect the an event viewer related logs, say example, I want entire inventory of the event logs. What is the size of the path it is stored, for example. So this is the class. If I'm trying to enable, what happens is in the background, as soon as I click OK, so it's going to actually compile with the exe file called mofcomp, right? We talked about the WMI, the early classes. In the introduction itself, in that section itself, we talked about the webbing, so that I prepared you very well for the basic level, the beginners, who doesn't know about the importance of the WMI. Also, I talked about it. So this is where the mofcomp.exe file will be there. So this mofcomp.exe file will be used against to the classes that we added here. So that gets actually compiled. So I'm just going to click on OK, but before clicking OK, I'll just select the top level line, which is 151.20. So one line I'm leaving, so that the changes doesn't go on immediate basis. So we will have a time to view. So just clicking on OK. So in the background, what happens is, we talked about the inboxes also. If you can remember the inboxes, we talked about the mofcomp or all the inboxes. Which are data loader, all those. So let's open up that inboxes. In fact, in the background, the log also got updated. So if you can little bit check it here. So what happened is, it has not its started looks like the classes. You can check it here. It's actually compiling the background of those latest mof file by taking the backup. So that information you can talk about it. So whatever the MIF files and the MOV files information also you can talk about it. So you can talk by starting with client agents, and then how best you can segregate that client agent related settings by having multiple agents and assigning for that specific. For example, if the people who are using AutoCAD, you wanted to get the hardware inventory, so it's no need to collect from every machine. So instead, if you know the AutoCAD related licensing information from the machines found as the AutoCAD, you can create a collection and assign that client agent. So you can talk these kind of scenarios that will boost up the other confidence on you to put it into the positive state. The next question would be the differences between the application deployment as well as the packages deployment. So as you know, that the latest applications or the latest mechanism where it can determine whether the user's machine or the device machine where it is targeted, as well as it knows that it can use your global conditions. In fact, it knows that which kind of deployment method to be used, whether if the user is coming from a kiosk machine, so what kind of deployment it should happen, whether it should be just the AFI based application or the proper MSI application. So that kind of configurations, specific discussions can be started to this question. In fact, so if in our course we also talked about the applications deployment about 4+ hours, almost 4.5 hours. We talked very extensively on the software deployment. We also talked about the API sequencing and API applications deployment, and the different catalog information which can be utilized like a self-service portal. And also we talked about the global conditions and the exclude, include, and a lot other options you can explore, and you can talk on that point of view. If you ask for the client side, the logs, you should be actually well good enough to talk about the client side logs because of the applications. Maybe it is how it is actually installing what are the components that the client side is getting actually triggered. So to begin with, you should actually talk about the policy agent, which talks about whether the policy is received. For example, it would be pointing into the policy ID information. It gives you that information. Then the policy agent becomes is the policy evaluator. That means it's gonna evaluating that policy. That means it's applying that policy. Then you would be getting the information under exec mgr. Let's talk that log file. Also, once you get it under exec mgr, that's the execution manager, what happens is it will ask, hey, where's the content, how I'm gonna, what kind of program I'm gonna use to get it installed, right? So it's gonna all ask all those questions within that policy. So in the background, it's gonna ask to download the content from the CAS site. So the CAS is the content access services, which would initiate to download the required packages from the SCCM server or from different locations. In fact, this is a plain SCCM, so I don't have anything much here to show up, but the CAS comes into the picture, but it doesn't aim at the CAS side. In fact, it's gonna actually validate your location. So are you connected over the internet or intranet, and what is your nearest distribution point, whether this cache is available by my piece or within my boundary by somebody else. So that kind of information would be asked under client locations, where we talked about this in one of the interview question also in the beginning of this discussion, in fact. So this is where it's going to talk, and then it checks, and then actually content gets transferred with the content transfer manager log. So let's open that also, content transfer manager log. So this is the content transfer manager is the one who determines with how the content should be downloaded, whether you are going to download from the DP as the base or maybe SMB. That information will be decided under content transfer manager. Now once it is decided, it's gonna pass it to data transfer service, which is just below to that. So this is where actually it records the bits related activities. For example, if you can see here, the policy related information it is pulling up. So it's not just the packages, including the policy related information also. It will pull up the same method, because anything you download, it's going to be recorded in your logs. So this is data transfer, records that information here, and then if you are have the content, it's gonna store in your SCCM cache. So SCCM cache is this is where it's here. So here it creates a random folders, and then it puts that files, and then it's gonna execute whether properly. So in any case, if you're getting an error, let's take one of the error, maybe and show here, if you're getting an error, let's say you got maybe error code 1. So how do you find out? So you can find that information from tools and error lookup. If you just control L, also a shortcut comes up. So if you press 1, it tells that, hey, it's an incorrect function. So whatever the code which is coming up, that information will be useful for us to get more error detailed information. Say that's it's success, so somewhere here it is success, but it is not showing any of the code. In any case, if you are getting some kind of codes, that also we can get that information. In fact, we talked about this, how to check the error codes in CM trees in the previous demos, in fact. But I can also tell you, if you don't have that CM trace on your machine, so how do you troubleshoot further? So I'll simply press net and the space, and then I'm going to type as help MSG, and whatever the error code you have. For example, if I have 1619 example, so it's gonna give that information about, hey, the 1619 stands for the package could not be opened. So whether really the package is available on that target source or not, you can find out that information. So that's where you should be able to check it. And also sometimes the applications may not enough time to execute. So to that point of view, maybe they might ask you a question that the patches are failing, how best you can troubleshoot. So you should be talking about starting from the content policies and the logs at the client machine side. So we talked about the client side also for the patch management very detailedly. In fact, if you can remember, I gave you one of the wonderful idea. If you can simply go back to CCM's logs and sort with the descending order, whatever you have with the descending order, all those are the logs relevant to your patch management. So you can start telling about, hey, whether this machine is really scanned. So that information you can talk, and you can talk about the W handler and the deployment store and updates deployment, all that logs you can talk about it. And Also, you can very well do the more information drill down, because you don't have the access to the machines most of the time, because it's not mandatory to have the access on client machines. Instead, what we do is we would actually go back to our status messages and pull that information, what exactly the errors are coming up. So if the people are asking about how do you troubleshoot on the client machines, or if a deployment fails, or maybe patches fails, from where do you start? In fact, you can check from the monitoring. This is where the key, in fact. So relevant reports can be run here, or you can simply go to the deployments and take the specific deployment status and monitor it, what went wrong, in fact. And also we can look into the status messages. This is where more advanced detailed information you can get it here under status messages queries, and just go for all status messages, or later point you start filling up the way you want it. For example, I want just for a specific package, so simply go back to advanced and here choose the as attachment message, and then maybe collection ID related, for example, or maybe whatever the components or whatever the property value you want to look for it, you can filter later point. So that's how you can without touching the client machines, you can do the troubleshooting. In fact, I'm sorry if I don't write here. Maybe I may be going out of the topic, so I just wanted to take it myself to straightly go back to the question. So in this case, the next question comes as the what exactly the discovery methods, or what exactly the DDRs. So if somebody is asking for you these questions, you should be able to answer about the discovery methods, what you have in your SCCM, and the uses of the discovery cases or discovery methods in this case. We can check up here different mechanisms, what you have or methods you have for the discovery method. So starting from the user to discover the user objects, you can very well tell about these descriptions for your interviewer, about why you have to choose user discovery or system discovery or group discovery, and what happens if you choose the forest discovery. This could be one of the possible questions, I would say, at least in terms of discovery methods. So once you enable this discovery methods, it itself creates all the boundaries for you. It goes to the entire forest level and digs whatever the subnets you have over the internet, and that would be created automatically. And later point, all you have to do is just creating the required boundary groups. That way you get benefited out of this. And let's also talk about the log files for each of these. We also very well talked about all these information in our course related to the log files, how to identify. In fact, we did shade easiest method to remember the log files, especially for the Active Directory discovery related logs. If you can see here, A, D, if you take the first letters of any of these discovery, and if you just compare with these, this you can easily understand. For example, AD, that is Active Directory, and SG stands for here system group discovery, okay, and DIS stands for the discovery. So these are the log files you can tell definitely. And also the configuration for these logs, for example, the delta discovery pooling schedule, which is in this case just 5 minutes. Some of the companies, in fact, if they are using the third party or a specific attribute value they wanted to take as the inventory, in that case they can simply also they wanted to discover that specific value also, in fact. So but it's a very rare case. In fact, maybe you may not get relevant questions in that case. So also, if you are more aggressive, what happens is, in the background, these components, in fact, the discovery, or you take any of the components, we did talk about very well about the inboxes management in this course, in fact. So if you just go back to your inboxes, the discovery related inboxes, either DDR related, everything gets. If I can open and one of the log
for example, in this case, active directory system group discovery or system discovery. In fact, I'm sorry. So this system discovery, what happens is whatever the discovery it found, for example, it has created one of the DDR file. In this case, it's a random name .ddr file that is actually storing under auth ddm.box file. So these inboxes sometimes gets overloaded. That's called overload process. We call it as a backlog. So that means it should actually clear by this time, but for some reason it is still as a still there as a backlog. So you need to process them, but for the discovery mechanism it might not really need it, but you may face different issues related to the inbox backlogs. So we did talk about all those inboxes. In fact, in our training under the section 10, we did talk about the inboxes. In fact, about almost close to more than 1 hour or close to 1 hour of the discussion, which we talked about each of those inboxes and the components in the background, how they work and how they internally changes the files. And that's where one of the questions can be expected related to the inboxes and their process. That would be sometimes the people may ask you a stupid question also. Let me write down that. So there's no question as stupid, in fact, right? So here people may ask you as, can I upgrade my secondary site to a primary site, or maybe can I change my secondary site to primary site? Say, as part of my design, I thought a remote branch office location altogether, maybe the less of the infrastructure, but later point it has been expanded, and can I migrate that secondary site to the primary? So definitely no is the answer. No. The reasons behind it can't be upgraded. It's a design change, right? It's going to be completely designed. So all you have to do is you have to either install new primary site there, and then if you want to pre-stage, preload, instead of sending all the packages over the internet or over the WAN, you can simply load. You can do side by side kind of migration kind of thing, at least for the files part. But you can't do a full level of migration, in fact. Or another way, Microsoft is not supported this scenario. So the answer is no, in fact. Also, sometimes people may ask that, hey, can I have a secondary site, also maybe a child site or something like that? They may put up, no, you can't have a secondary site. So secondary sites always reports to a primary site, and there's no option. But you can have a remote distribution point. That means from there to secondary site location to another branch office, or maybe another location within that region, you can have a remote distribution point. That could be one of the question or one of the design way. So I just remember or recall by looking into a discovery methods question. So people may ask you a question related to, can I install SCCM client without being discovery? Yes, you can do that. What happens is, with the discovery, you are actually importing from your Active Directory or from the network by doing a simple discovery, and you're showing on your SCCM collection. That's all you are doing actually. To overcome or to install a machine which is, you are not even, in fact you don't need to enable all the discovery methods. By default, the heartbeat discovery mechanism would be enabled for 7 days or weekly. So if you enable that, or if you keep it as it is, or if you're not touch the discovery methods, you can install the clients. But how do you install the client? So without the discovery, you can't push the SCCM clients. So if you remember the client deployment methods we talked about, so for the client push, you need to have the discovery method. That means the object should be available on your SCCM collections. Then it can deploy the SCCM client. So if you are trying to specific to this question, you want to have a SCCM client without discovery. That means, for example, in this case, there's a machine called CM01. It was discovered on this machines. If you enable the client push, it will check, hey, this machine has a client as yes or no. So if found as no, then it will try to connect to this machine with the admin dollar, and then it installs the SCCM client, right? So if you want to do it manually, yeah, definitely what happens is, as soon as you need to understand this question, maybe another way, once the client is installed, in fact it's going to be registered with the SCCM server, a unique identity. So let's have a look on that. That's the log file. We talked about it, in fact, in our client ID manager. So let's open up this client ID manager startup log. So this is the log which talks about registration of this client machine with SCCM server. So what happens is, as soon as you install the SCCM client, or when you triggered, in fact, the SCCM services, it will check for the registration record in SCCM server. So what happens is there is a file under smscfg.ini file. In fact, we talked about this also for the imaging side. So this is a file which has the GUID. So this SMS unique identifier, this is the identifier. With this identifier, SCCM client is when you perform an action on SCCM server, then it's going to communicate with this GUID. So this is the unique identity, in fact. So with this ID, if I just copy this and go back to my client ID manager startup, and if I search for this, it will be somewhere here with this. So what it is trying to do is, if you see registering task, this is basically, so it is trying to registration with this ID to the SCCM server. So for some reason it has failed, but let's ignore for a minute or so here, and then it is registered now, and it got that identity here, in fact, and it is proceeded further. So this is how the identity would be established. That means either you client push or client install manually, how the SCCM client knows or how the SCCM server will identify the clients is with the unique ID. So that's where the answer comes. So can I push, can I install SCCM client without being discovery? Yes, you can do. So once you install the SCCM client, what happens? It's discovered. So it will be showing in the SCCM consoles. That's it. So you can very well do the installation part without doing any discovery methods. People may ask you, how do you take the backup of your SCCM server? As we discussed in our training videos. So this is where the question comes, how do you take the SCCM backup and how do you restore? So for that entire section, I have created 1.5 hour plus video, especially on the backup. So I did take the backup and then crashed my SCCM server completely and build on a new hardware altogether from the scratch with the backup, and then restore the backup, and the client communication we were tested, we pushed some packages, everything was working fine. So if somebody asking how do you take the backup, so this section would be the very good or solid answer. In other way, you can answering in other way, like you can go to the maintenance tasks of that specific site and configure the site backup. But there are a lot of limitations. In fact we did talk about the limitations. Let's open up the site maintenance here. This is where you can back up the SCCM backup can be enabled here, in fact. But there are a lot of recommendations, like we talked about when to take, when not to take. You can review that section, in fact, because I don't want to repeat again, because that entire video was in my views, it's configured or it's delivered in such a way, how, why, and these are the questions has been added. So just check that video, but you can configure from here, and you can check the backup log file and so forth. There could be one more question related to this is a backup. Let me answer that for you. How do you start the SCCM backup as soon as possible? Or you think that it's going to be important for you, so you wanted to take the SCCM backup. So what you do is you would go back to services, and I did actually shown this also twice. The two possible options. One would be from the SCCM services. You can start here the SMS backup services, the site backup. So this would be a manual to start state. So that would take that would actually initiate the SCCM backup for you. So this would be the answer, and you can monitor the log file. There could be one possible question on SCCM client side. How do you install SCCM client and the installation process, maybe workflow, which should be starting from your client installation and the exe files, That way, if you can try to answer yourself, you may in a good position to answer anything related to the SCCM client installation or uninstallation part. So let's jump into that section. First and foremost, I'm just going to the SCCM client machine. In this case, this is the client. So what happens is, to install the SCCM client, all you have to do is to have this ccm setup.exe file. This file can be available on SCCM server under SCCM client folder. So from there, if you just copy to one of the machine, and then you can double click to install. But when you try to double click it, it may or may not install properly. Why I say is yes, no, because sometimes if it is really found the required information from the from the Active Directory, when I say the required information, site code, management point, and distribution point, or the client installation folder, everything, it gets installed. Otherwise, it might fail. So what we have to do is we have to pass some command line to install. So the command line, if you can look into it, so what happens is when you try to install with this exe, it actually creates a folder called logs folder. Within that, ccm setup folder, and then it also starts the ccm setup.log file. So this is a log file used to review or gives you more information about installation and uninstallation. So in this case, if you can look at here, what's happening is it's gonna install here with the ccm setup, or it has, in fact, this is the patch actually. It is showing the patch related question, but if you can remediation, that means the client was not good. So it is trying to remediate with the /remediate equivalent client with the log file. Otherwise, you would find ccm setup.exe and as much site code and blah blah things within the log file. So technically what happens is this client will go and communicate with the Active Directory. Within the Active Directory sites and the Active Directory systems management container, we talked about the system management container, right? So that's where it's gonna check for whether we have any of the site code related information and the boundary information, and if so, what happens is it just simply jump into that site code information. It will simply grab and then it try to put that values. If not, you need to provide manually the site code information. If you have not provided in any case the SMS site code information, it's going back to the AD and it pulls that information. Let me show you that wizard. So here under systems management, this is where the management point related as well as the site code related information will be populated. So as we talked about in the previous, or maybe in the part of our course, we talked about this schema extension and what happens. All that story comes here, and you can talk about that. And this is where it will pick that site code automatically if you give the command as R2, and then the client will install. Once, as soon as the client is installed, it will start pulling the information. To pull the information from the SCCM server, all it has to do is it has to register, as we talked about in the previous questions. It's going to be client ID manager, and also it's gonna in the meantime it also logged location services and as well as the client location. These are the two logs also triggers along with the client ID manager startup.log file. Once a client is registered, that means in the SCCM console actually it's going to be approved by default. So by default it's not going to be approved, but you have a configuration without knowing to you. So once that as part of that it's going to be automatically approved. Once it is approved, the site you would actually showing here, you would be listed here the SCCM client. There could be one more question related to the importing from one server, especially for example you have a production or maybe a lab servers example, and you wanted to export the as it is the applications for which you have tested in your maybe on development side. You want as it is to be exported to your production. So in that situation, what you can do is you can very well actually in fact it's running sometime. For example, how the collection memberships can be exported, or so once you export this and import it on your another infrastructure, you get it the same information. So that gets exported in the format of MOF format. So if I simply select this and go on next, I would be getting as a MOV file formatted. This MOV is different than what we talked about, sms_def.mov file or configuration.mov file. So both are different, but it's just get those exact objects. Similarly, you can also do the packages can be also exported. For example, in this case, if you wanted all these packages one way to export, you can export as a package format, including the source, and everything can be exported. Similarly, the task sequence also, sometimes a working task sequence can be more useful for you. So you can export the task sequences, boot images, driver packages, whatnot. Most of the stuff can be exported, and you can later point can be import into your required configuration. So the next question would be, can I wake up a machine which may be in a power state as down state example? That means powered off machine. I want to wake up that machine, just a single machine. Can I do that? Yes, starting from the 1902 you can do it very well, or 1806 or 1802, I don't remember, but yes, you can do that at least on the 1902 console. If you take this machine and if the client is already available, you can simply go to client actions. From this is where you can do the machine policy initiate, policy pull up, and software inventory you can force, hardware inventory you can force, and application deployment. That means whatever the applications you have targeted can be forced to get it triggered. Similarly, the software updates is option is here. So all these actions will be performed if the machine is online. But what happens if the machine is offline? So that's where the wake up option also given by Microsoft with the recent features or the recent feedback that as the SCCM users has been reported, or the customers reported to Microsoft, and now you can do the wake up as well as you can do the restart also, in fact. So you don't need to have to use another tools to do all these things. Straightforward, you can do it from SCCM console. The next question would be maybe for the applications side, the global conditions. The global conditions are the key. In fact, once you create the one of the global condition, you can reuse them again and again. So people may ask you about any of the global condition related questions. For example, if I wanted to deploy some specific application where the user must be a primary user should be login, and also the make or the model is like that, or maybe operating system is this and the service pack version is this, some kind of critical things you wanted to use again and again. So go ahead and create the global conditions and use them in your application deployment as part of your application deployments. So that would be one other question. Maybe you need to look into it. There could be one kind of not exactly the question, but you should be aware of at least with the software distribution, you can do the script-based softwares can be deployed or scripts can be executed, or let's put it in this way, the question would be, can I deploy a package without any source? Yeah, very much possible. What exactly the package it doesn't mean that you need to have the source, right? At the end, the deployment will have an execution command. So if the command it just triggers on that machine, and whatever the command output is coming up, that will be showing back to the SCCM server. So in this case, if you don't have the source also, that's fine, but the command is important. So with that command, what you're trying to do, maybe you're trying to delete a folder, or maybe on a C drive, or maybe you're trying to install an application which is already available on a C drive of the client machines. So in that case, you don't need to have a source because the source is already available in the client machine. So all you have to do is you need to have the program, just to create here a program that would make more sense to execute on the target machine. So that would be one other question I would think about it. Yeah, this would be the same question maybe, but in another way. When do you choose primary site versus secondary site versus distribution point? So this would be one of the designing questions. So you need to think about that question by going back to what exactly the primary site, and talk about the primary site and the secondary site, then the distribution point and the scalability of those sites. So we did, in fact, we did have a web page open. In fact, we didn't touch it. It looks like the web page would be the sizing, scaling. So how many machines is going to support? For example, in a hierarchy, the central administration side can support almost 700,000 desktops as well as workstations, which includes your Windows, Linux, and Unix computers, and 25,000 of Windows CE machines. So this is what it can capable. But again, the conditions will be applied. So what kind of SQL you're going to use, whether it's going to be enterprise edition, then it's going to support. If it is a standard edition, it's going to be limited to only a maximum number, becomes as a lesser. So like that, there would be a different criterias, different scalability. So you need to think about all those and try to answer for them. Hey, I have these machines as very less, so I don't want to put an expensive machine there, and I don't want to make my hierarchy as a complicated, in fact. And that way you can very well communicate. If you can look at a management point, now with the management point shouldn't extend more than 25,000 machines. That kind of role can be enabled. So earlier also you do have these options. These numbers will change as the days progress, in fact, because when the Microsoft introduce some new features, they also have to think about the conditions of that infrastructure and that capabilities, whether they are supports with these. So similar things, you also think about the hardware. Tricky parts or tricky operations questions would be published.